Hello, my name is Maurice Washington. I want to welcome everybody to another episode of Executive Talk, those who are watching live and those who are listening later on our podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. In today's segment, we're going to talk about managing deregulation in your business. For business owners that are starting business, that are coming into the business world, those that are in business, a lot of them depend on deregulation, some don't. We're going to talk about the ins and outs of deregulation in your business and just how to have the proper perspective around that. And with me today to actually discuss a little bit further from the business insurance type of perspective is we have Rick Calloway with us, business insurers with Acrisure, and also we have Brian Fielkow with us. How you doing, gentlemen?
Doing just great. Looking for a good show.
How are you? Thanks for being here, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to actually talk about this topic. Because again, this is one of those things that are always in the background, but it always shows up in the front, front and center of a business owner's business decisions and how they operate their business. So it's very, very key for us to have this topic. Just in general, have you seen a lot of circumstances where deregulation? Do you feel like deregulation or regulation is important, an important aspect of a person's business, Brian? Let me start with you.
I mean, I've seen enough cycles go where you go into periods of deregulation, or at least people talk about it, to know that as a business executive, you don't have a lot of control over that, right? So you've got to keep track of the regulations, and obviously make a commitment to comply with the regulations. But just because there's talk of deregulation doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen or it's going to happen in your industry. So I think the best thing to do is just keep your eye on it, focus on running your business, and don't get too distracted by some of the talk, at least until it's a little bit further down the road.
That's fair. And we're going to go into and we're going to bring up some talking points, because this is huge. Because like you just said, business owners have their own perspective when it comes to deregulation or regulation aspects of it all. And here's some of the viewpoints on how they view it. So if I'm a business owner, they look at it as, spurring of economic growth, also higher efficiency with the freedom of deregulation provides, no rules to specify how they can run their factories or whether they can use specific materials to produce goods and also services, reducing bureaucratic red tape also frees up capital for companies to invest in labor or new equipment. Companies can lower the fees and attract new customers. Deregulation can boost competition and lower prices for consumer sectors, and also reduction of barriers to entry. New business don't have many fees or regulatory considerations, so it's less expensive to enter market. So in a lot of situations, it seems like CEOs push for deregulation because they get excited about these factors. Have you seen that in your experience, Brian and Rick?
What I've seen more, Maurice, is business owners, rightfully so, get annoyed by regulations that seem to create waste, and they don't do a lot of good. So I don't know of really very many that want bare bones or zero regulation. And think about yourself not as a business owner, but think of yourself as a consumer. You're on a plane. You're at the grocery store buying food. Every day, you're at the drugstore. You're filling a prescription. Every day, you're relying on some level of regulation to keep you safe. And I don't know that we would necessarily look. My background before joining Acrisure was for many years owning, growing trucking and logistics business.
Okay.
And one of the regulations would be a professional truck driver can only drive and work so many hours before they've got to take a break. So if you removed a regulation like that, then it could be that the driver next to you is operating in kind of this no man's land where they can go 24 hours, right? So it's really a balance between regulations that benefit the public, that benefit society as a whole, and rightfully wanting to see regulations that are more burdensome than benefit they produce are repealed. I really believe most business people take a rational, balanced approach. I mean, I don't know anybody that wants, geez, let's triple the amount of regulation. By the same token, I know very few that are like, just get rid of all of them. It's balanced.
Right. Okay.
Regulations are a tricky place, like Brian was saying. We need to have some protection, but we need not to be overburdened. And we're in the insurance business, and we're probably one of the most regulated industries as to what we can do and what we can't do. Brian's past life trucking, there was more regulations than he could put miles on his trucks probably. But some industries basically have none.
A friend of mine that was in the logistics business told me, he goes, I used to be in banking, and man, I thought banking was a regulated industry until I got into trucking. So yeah, I mean, it's these are regulated industries, and you got to remember a lot of times regulations can be put in place in response to circumstances that happened in the past.
Right. They've just some regulations are just still hanging on there that were put in there for something that happened in the past, but it was 50 years ago in the past, and it's probably not likely to happen again, but they still cause a burden on a particular industry. So I think for every regulation they put in place, they should have to review and take one out of place that's really not effective. People can't deal with the regulations if they can't read through the book that has all of them in there. They need to know what applies to their industry so they properly run their business.
I think the best thing you could do in a business now, let's say you're in kind of a Main Street type business where you may call a regulator and they may not pick up the phone. The best thing you can do is find your trade association and see what or associations, several, and see what they're doing on the regulations that are important to you. And you've got a voice, and if you think a regulation is, as you say, Rick, archaic, overly burdensome relative to the benefit it produces. We did that in a couple instances, working with state and federal trade associations and commenting on the rulemaking period. We were actually able to get some regulations repealed or revised. So, you do have a voice, and so it's important to use it if you think there's just a regulatory environment it's not making sense for your business.
It makes sense.
Or industry.
And this brings up this point right here, and it's regulatory waves go in cycles. And what you just mentioned is the cycles. Some of those regulations could have been 50 years ago. And now this particular cycle and this particular juncture in time, we don't have that regulation, or that regulation is now prevalent again. One thing that business owners like is they like that freedom. There's a level of freedom that comes, and we talked about in the CEO's viewpoint just a second ago. In this regulatory wave and cycles, how does a business owner seem to navigate that? So if you're managing your business during these regulatory waves, is this a constant? Do you hire somebody specific to watch these regulatory? Do you follow up on these at least once a year? Should this be a process and procedure? What's the business shift in this moment?
If you're big enough, you may have someone that watches out for this stuff. But like Brian said, the talk about the regulations start now, and they'll go on for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before they even implement everything. You have to run your business like a business. You just have to be aware of the regulations that you're mandated to apply to your business while it's running. Some of the regulations that in the trucking industry don't have anything to do with the restaurant industry. Things in the, like the food handling in the restaurant industry, those are regulations. One, you need to be aware of those because they're laws, but two, your clientele will probably be pretty happy if you're handling food properly before they're served to them. So regulations apply to each industry for specific reasons. If something gets in our way when we're doing anything, we consider it burdensome, but it may just be that as a fact of life, you have to deal with this. It's for the safety of your clientele and the safety of your business. Lawyers love to sue people over regulatory violations.
Well, to the point about cycles, sometimes the regulatory cycle is, as Rick said, that you got a regulation that's on the books that's outdated, but sometimes the market shifts. I mean, technology, manufacturing advancements create unforeseen environments. Like for example, right now in cities, I mean, San Francisco is most notable, but Phoenix and others, robo-taxis. Taxis that have no human being in the vehicle. I don't think anybody thought 30 years ago about regulating those. But now the state and federal regulators have to look at it and figure out what are the safety standards and where should government intervene, or should it really be an unregulated, Wild West, which we know that answer. So sometimes technology and business advancement necessitates a different regulatory look that we just kind of foresee, earlier.
That's actually a good point, because when somebody comes out with new tech or new technology, a new product, a new service that the insurance company or the government or has not caught up with and is familiar with, how long does those regulations take to really catch up to where it becomes a standard code? So you bring it onto market, it happens fairly quick. You're trying to see it happen before then. I think regulations start to come on board maybe a couple of years afterwards. Is this pretty much how the cycle works when it comes to those regulations?
The cycle depends on the most amount of complaints based on a regulation. At first, like the robotaxi, they may come in over-regulated because nobody knows,
Right.
what's going on. So those regulations may develop over time, because their biggest concern with the robotaxis is injury to the passenger, to other vehicles. So they've got to monitor that to see how it's regulated. And I don't even know what constraints they put on something. Do you have to have sensors in 42 different places on your vehicle to pick up the other things? Those are the things they're going to be looking at, and nobody knows that.
For sure. Okay. Great point.
Sometimes, in a lot of cases, done right, the regulation, the regulatory environment happens in cooperation with industry. I'm not saying partnership, right? It's not like, but
right.
But in the best case scenario, like the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the commercial passenger industry in the U.S. work very closely. And even though we've had some recent near misses and nothing is, there's certainly some scary stuff out there. If you look at the track record of U.S. commercial aviation industry over the past 3-4 decades, it's enviable. And a lot of that is, if you look behind the scenes, you'll see that the regulators and the industry got to a point where they were moving in the same direction. And a lot of good has come out of that.
Yeah, you're much safer flying than driving in a car. Unless, of course, I'm flying the plane, then it may be a little
bit. Then you need a lot of regulation in that case. I got you. So let me ask you this question, gentlemen. Does less regulation inspire more competition? And here's the thought process I've been thinking about for the past week or so. And let me know if this accounts for the same example. So remember the mortgage boom, the mortgage industry, where everybody, the mortgage rates are at their all-time low. Everybody just kind of jumped into the marketplace because the mortgage industry was hot. Didn't really have any regulations to come into place. You didn't have to go through, you didn't have to go to the state. You just had to register your business, and you created your mortgage business, and you're out there servicing loans. Years later, we had a kind of a issue per se when it came to the mortgages. Now, beyond the issue, because there was less regulation on that, did it inspire more people to come into the industry? Is that a good example, or is there a better one?
Well, there was also regulation in there that required that banks and lenders lend to people who weren't necessarily qualified completely for their loans. And that's created a big debacle in the industry. That's why all of those loans went into default. So that's an example of, quote, less regulations on who can come in and get a loan and who can't. And that created huge problems.
Gotcha. Brian, what do you have to say on this?
To me, the question is whether regulations impact on people entering the market. I think you could argue it both ways. I mean, certainly you don't want to create barriers to entry that are unreasonable or that stifle competition. On the other hand, if I'm in an industry and I'm doing everything I can to comply with the regulations, I'm respecting, worker safety rules, OSHA, and you start to strip those away, then my competitor next door theoretically could come in, start a business, and operate at a much lower standard. And so,
Right.
does it really impact? Do less regulations always have the intended result that people think, which is, it'll open up competition, it'll remove barriers to entry, or at some point, does it could it cause an industry to operate to a lower and less desirable common denominator? It's a question I would throw out there.
Absolutely. And you said the key word, which is impact. So the impact is that trust factor on the industry. You see a lot of industries that have a lot of great deal of respect, but there's a lot of regulation per se on the back end that keeps that respect there. And you don't see people crossing a lot of barriers. But then you see some of those deregulation industries that, anybody can come, but you see the reputation that comes along with that. I think that's another impact to really consider when it comes to, the kind of the direct consequences.
Reputation is highly important no matter what business. There's unscrupulous operators in every business you can think of, from construction to trucking to insurance.
Absolutely.
And there's nothing you can do about that. The companies that function as they should and follow the regulations probably have less complaints, less problems. So those are the folks you want to do business with. If you're just out there to save money, you're probably going to put yourself in trouble, because you may end up doing business with someone who's not quite as scrupulous as the others in the industry. You should look to the trade associations were mentioned earlier. You should look to those trade associations for folks that you want to do business with, because they're vetted within their own industry. Nobody better to vet someone in an industry as someone that understands the industry.
That's right. Yep. This is the good one. And Brian brought this to our attention, kind of the safety cultures versus the non-compliance culture. What's the difference in, what is, since we're just came off the topic of impact, what is the impact on the safety culture versus the non-compliance culture?
Well, we've spent most of our time so far on this chat talking about regulations, but for most industries, let's agree that regulations generally do prescribe the bare minimum. So just because you're regulatory compliant, just because you have a compliance culture, does not mean you're operating safely. I mean, to me, regulatory compliance and safety excellence are distantly related at best. So in a compliance culture, the focus is on, would we pass a government audit? Would we pass an OSHA audit? Would we pass a DOT audit? Are the boxes checked? If they are, we're okay. And in my experience, that's not a way to run a business to its maximum safety and operational potential. In a safety culture, the focus is on people, process, leadership, non-negotiable values, there being a way that this is how we operate, and you'll never get that in regulations. The best example I can give you, because it's kind of was in the news a while ago and people still remember it, is, as I said before, in trucking, you can operate, a driver can drive, so many hours in one duty cycle. They can drive 11 and be on duty for 14. Well, if you remember back in, I think it was in New Jersey, there was a horrific truck crash where a truck literally drove over a limousine that was occupied by actor Tracy Morgan and his passengers. And that driver of the truck only had been on duty for like an hour. So he was perfectly legal. Every compliance box was checked, beautiful. But before he got into his truck, he drove from Atlanta to Newark in his personal car without rest. So he'd been up for like 20 something hours without rest. So in a compliance culture, okay, he was legal on his hours of service, but so what? So what? In a safety culture, we focus on managing our own behavior, on doing the right thing when nobody's looking. that's when operational excellence and arises. And from Rick's point of view, those are the clients that will shine when they're working with their insurance carriers. To me, being regulatory compliant is the bare minimum. You have to be. It's not a matter of whether you should or shouldn't. But true safety and true operational excellence goes way beyond compliance. So I see safety culture and compliance culture as two different things.
How many of the trucking places that you've been in and around were compliant but had horrible workers' comp and safety records and thought they were doing the right thing because they were compliant?
Yeah, because they're looking at the minimum standards, and the thinking is, if I comply with the minimum, I'm okay. For example, a best practice is we know in trucking is to have dual facing truck cameras. You want a camera facing outside and a camera facing inside the cab. But that's not regulated. That's not required. There's no law. So in a safety culture, you consider that and consider whether that's an investment you should make, even though there's no law requiring you to.
Gotcha. That's a huge deal. I like that analogy. That makes a lot of sense. When you bring it out to recordable versus non-recordable incidents, because again, a lot of people that are watching this program or that will watch this program later, these are differences that we need to understand. Just the standard, and this is what they're bringing up right now, folks. Is there's a standard that can be achieved even though regulations are not. So when you talk about recordable versus non-recordable incidents, what does that mean in your world there, Brian?
What it means to me is this: an injury is a OSHA recordable if certain facts exist. An injury is a crash is a DOT recordable if certain facts exist, right? Having to do with lost time, having to do with the severity of the injury, tow away. I mean, the point is, if these boxes are checked, it's a recordable. If the boxes aren't checked, it's not recordable. And what I always advise people to do is don't give recordables all this attention and ignore non-recordables, because whether or not something is recordable is a matter of, at some point, something the government said, if these boxes are checked, it's a recordable. But it doesn't make the non-recordables something you should ignore or something that's less worthy of attention. And it goes back to our safety culture and our compliance culture. In a compliance culture, you might have a business that gets really worked up about recordables because, oh gosh, it's going to go on our federal record. It's going to go on our OSHA logs. In a safety culture, you're saying, I'm going to treat them the same, because every incident that has a degree of preventability, and many do, you want to learn from, regardless whether the outcome checked the boxes or not. So that the recordable versus non-recordable to me is a good hallmark of how they're treated by us in a safety culture, as opposed to how a compliance-focused culture might treat them. It's the same thing, which again is that regulations are the bare minimum, and you got to go beyond compliance, especially in this day and age. To Rick's point earlier, we're in a very litigious society, right? And if all you're doing is focused on the boxes being checked, it'd be very difficult when you're on the witness stand being deposed.
And if you focus just on the recordable and not the unrecordable, you may start developing bad habits. I mean, if you've got a driver that continually backs into the dock and breaks their taillights, that's not definitely a recordable incident, but obviously maybe the driver needs a little driver training. So you have to look at the non-recordables probably even more closely than the recordables, because those are indicating trends.
Huge, huge, huge. And then last but not least, what are the most important regulations that a person or a company should consider when managing their business?
You've got
Once
two
you,
sides to-
I'm sorry, go ahead, Rick.
You've got two sides. You've got the regulations that affect your business, what you need to do and how you need to operate, but you also need to look at the regulations that affect your vendors. Are your vendors compliant? Are they doing what you're supposed to? If you're making airplanes and you're buying a product from somebody for one small little piece of that aircraft, and they haven't been paying attention to the regulations, the specifications, what they're supposed to be doing, you and they are both going to be in trouble if that plane has difficulty landing, taking off, or flying. So you've got to look at regulations that affect you and regulations that affect, and regulations that affect your clients, because we're all dealing with safety. We all want our clients to get proper products, be driven around safely. So those are the most important regulations.
This is a critical point, is I think your clients will appreciate that you've taken the time to understand the regulatory environment in which they operate. I think that's a really important point, because clients want to work with vendors that just aren't cookie cutter and that understand what's going on in the client's business. So if you're going into a service a food manufacturer, and you don't need to be an expert, right? But if you know something about and have studied the food manufacturing regulations that they're subject to, I think most clients would really respect that and look at you differently than somebody's just sort of coming in with unprepared. But to the question, Maurice, about what regulations are the most important, I'll put the word regulations in quotes. It's your own. It's your own processes and procedures. That's what you got to focus on, is, do you have clear processes and procedures? Do your employees know that this is how we do things here? You may have worked at a different company. You may have come across the street from brand X. And at brand X, they might have done things a certain way. And that's all well and good, but that's not how we do them here. So it's important to have rules and regulations that are understandable by the audience for whom they're written. The people are trained on those rules and regulations. There's accountability for following them. So it's your own internal rules that, in my mind, are the most important, quote unquote, regulations. And that is where we go beyond compliance.
That's where you want to develop the safety culture, because that's the most important piece of operating your business. Downtime costs you money. Injuries cost you money. You don't want people hurt. You don't want your production shut down. And you have to involve every level of employees in working on that safety culture. The president of the company can't just say, oh, we're going to have a safety culture, and that's the last it's said about it. It has to be, how often do good companies have safety meetings and discuss that stuff? Probably pretty regularly, because it's changes. It needs to be reinforced. Safety is a repeatable thing. You have to do it safely over and over again.
That's right.
And to your point, it's got to be leader driven and employee owned. It's not either or. Leaders have to drive it. Leaders can't look the other way, but employees have to be trained on it, and they've got to own it. And everybody's got to behave in accordance with the rules you've set. I think that's Maurice, in the conversation we've had, right? We started off talking about deregulation and what's going on in the current political environment. But where we really come is that whatever regulations get enacted, whatever regulations get repealed, you got to keep track of that. But that's not, I think we came across and came to the conclusion that that's not really the point. The point is, how you want to run your business and what are the best practices while you're keeping track of whatever happens and whatever comes out of DC.
And since the majority of the regulations are all about safety, if you're running your business safely, you're probably in compliance with the regulations. If you're doing something iffy, you're probably out of compliance with the regulations.
100%. Gentlemen, I'm in awe. And I'm in awe because this is the most comprehensive way of actually looking at deregulation. This is the most mature way as far as looking at deregulation. And this is exactly where we need to start to evolve to, or be, as business owners. And this is really our responsibility. So I want to give each one of you opportunity to have a final thought that you'd like to give to the audience today. We'll start with you, Rick.
Great. I'll go first then. Run your business safely. Run it how you should within your business environment. Stay on top of your vendors to make sure they're compliant with things, because they can hurt you as well. And since these things may all lead to a lawsuit, you better have the proper insurance in place. So be sure to discuss your business with your insurance professional.
Awesome. How about you, Brian? What are your final thoughts?
Very much the same as Rick, which is focus on what you can control, focus on your business. The regulations that apply to you are important and you need to comply with them. But to me, that's not the driving force as to what's going to really help you achieve safety, operational, and ultimately bottom line excellence. And that's your people, your process, the quality of your leadership, accountability throughout the organization. Those are the keys, and that's where you're best off spending the vast majority of your time, while at the same time, keeping the eye on the ever-changing environment coming out of Washington and coming out of the state capitals throughout the country.
Amazing. Thank you, gentlemen, for your commentary in regards to deregulation. This is huge, and this will go a long way, and I appreciate that. I want to also thank you again for taking your time out of your schedule to talk to us about this. This is the top of the year. This is definitely something that we need to start shifting towards and really start shifting gears towards. So no matter what, this is the type of viewpoint that we should have on deregulation. I want to go ahead and stamp that approval on it today. So again, thank you both for taking your time, and we'll have both of you on again in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for those watching, I want to say thank you again for taking your time out of your schedule. And I hope that you understood the point here. As Brian alluded to, we started off talking about deregulation as a whole, and it can easily go into the government aspect, and we can easily point at the government and say no deregulation or regulation and so on and so forth. But we brought it back to the main point, which is managing your business in regards to deregulation. What is the strength of your business? It is what the regulation that you have within your business, the compliance, the safety, the care, from the leadership all the way to the employees. It's embodied regulation. It's embodied taking care of folks, and it shows out into the marketplace. And that's the type of execution that we want to have in the marketplace. And so those are the points. And again, when it comes to looking for your insurance agents to actually help you out and answer questions and help you structure your business around it to help you get through, this is where you reach out to folks like Brian and also Rick to help you manage your business and make sure you're secure all the way through. But again, thank you for your time. But Rick and I, and also Brian, we all have to get back to work. So we'll see you next time. Thank you.